Hey, folks, welcome to the CBCF ALC virtual conference. Of course, COVID-19 has impacted so many organizations all across the country and the world. And so we want to ensure that our people are kept safe. And so that's why we are doing this virtual. You certainly will still get the great information that you always get when you attend the CBCF ALC. So let's dive right into this. This session here deals with from the mailbox to the ballot box, exercising your right to vote in the age of COVID-19. Hence me wearing my Alpha's vote. Alpha Phi Alpha. And so this is a session, of course, led by Congresswoman Terry Sewell of Alabama. They know a little bit something about Black folks and the fight to exercise their ballot. So let's introduce her right now. And Congresswoman, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland. I want to thank our great panelists as well. I'm really excited about this very timely topic, voting in the age of the COVID-19.
And so, again, every year during CBC ALC, you really focus on this. This is also difficult for you and for so many of us, because this is the first CBC ALC where we don't have Congressman John Lewis. If you could just speak to that just for a moment.
Sure. You know, I got a chance. It's not often that you get a chance to meet your real life hero. But to have the opportunity, growing up in Little Selma, Alabama, to one day get to serve in Congress with John Lewis, to befriend him, to be able to call him a mentor and my hero and friend was just an honor of a lifetime. And, you know, when I think about John's legacy, nothing was more paramount to John's life work than voting rights. As he likes to say, or love to say, he shed a little blood on a bridge in my hometown for the right of every American to vote. And so we all have our part to do. I in Congress to try to fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was really gutted in the Shelby versus Holder decision. But every American has a role to play when it comes to voting in every election, state, local, and federal. So I'm humbled to have the opportunity to carry the seminal piece of legislation, H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which, by the way, has been renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020. It passed the House of Representatives December 6th, and it's languishing over on the Senate side as we speak. So nothing is more important when I think about living through this age of COVID-19 than really having a plan to vote in the 2020 elections.
Congresswoman Sewell, a lot of people always, I hear this all the time, you know, what is the CBC doing? They aren't doing anything. Why can't they get these things passed? But the reality is, as you said, H.R. 4 has already been passed by the House, is sitting over in the Senate. Y'all have done your job. Now it's up to them, which is also why the next election is so important, because as long as Mitch McConnell is majority leader, he is not going to move on that bill.
That's exactly right. And I know that nothing would make John prouder than to know that we've fully restored and advanced voting rights in America. But it really concerns me, as I'm sure it concerns all of the panelists. I know that we're going to be joined by 4 extremely outstanding panelists who are experts on this topic. Sherilyn Ifill, who is the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Latasha Brown, who's co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, and Derek Johnson, the 19th President and CEO of the NAACP, and Kristen Clark, who is President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. And you know, we are led ably by our moderator, none other than the nationally known commentator, journalist, and interviewer extraordinaire, Roland Martin. I want to thank all of you for joining me on this virtual ALC CBC panel on voting rights.
All right, let's get started. Let's kick it off with Sherilyn Ifill. Sherilyn?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Congresswoman Sewell, for really pulling us together, and so grateful to all of my colleagues who are on. This is the dream team of folks who are going to be steering the ship to get us through this perilous moment. And no better moderator than Roland Martin, because Roland Martin's a no-nonsense guy, and we are in a no-nonsense moment. In the 30 years that I have been a voting rights litigator, I have experienced no more perilous moment for the future of Black people in this country, for the integrity of American democracy, for the integrity of the right to vote, for the ability of Black people to exercise full citizenship and to walk in full dignity in this country. That means that this is all hands on deck. We are facing two pandemics. The first pandemic is the one we know well, the pandemic of racism and voter suppression that we have been fighting even before the Shelby decision, but made so much worse by the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County versus Holder case. By removing the preclearance provision from the Voting Rights Act, essentially, it allowed Southern jurisdictions, jurisdictions mostly in the South, to do things they could not have done before without a federal authority giving them permission. And having removed that restriction on Southern jurisdictions, the Supreme Court essentially created the circumstance in which what had once been a regional problem metastasized to becoming a national problem. Now jurisdictions like Wisconsin and Kansas and North Dakota and Pennsylvania were getting into the voter suppression game, so that we now have a national problem of voter suppression around the country. And if that wasn't bad enough, we then were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, which disproportionately affects African-American communities and has meant that many of us are understandably concerned about engaging in in-person voting. It has decimated the ranks of poll workers in many jurisdictions. For those of us who saw that primary election in Wisconsin and those long lines and the unsuccessful effort through the courts to try and expand absentee voter opportunities, the reason that there were so few polling places open in Milwaukee, where there are normally 180 polling places, and on election day in the primary, there were only 5 that were open, is because so many of our poll workers are elderly. They called out, understandably fearing COVID. And during that period, although 28% of the population in Milwaukee is Black, 70% of COVID deaths were of Black people. So we're challenged now with facing the reality that we've got to figure out how to vote in overwhelming numbers, but also vote safely. John Lewis risked his life on the Edmund Pettus Bridge for us to be able to vote, and he did not expect us to have to risk our lives to cast a ballot. So that means we need everything to be available to us. We need absentee voting, but we also need in-person voting that is safe. At the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization I lead, we have been at this work for a long time. Our first, most important win of the first decade of our existence in the 1940s was our 1944 win in Smith versus Allwright, in which we took a case to the Supreme Court that ultimately ended the use of all white primaries in the South. So we've been at this for a very, very long time. And we have been litigating this question around absentee voting, trying to relieve voters of the onerous burdens that many Southern states impose on absentee voting. We've filed suit in Arkansas, in Alabama, in Louisiana, in South Carolina. In a number of those cases, we have won at trial, wonderful, detailed decision from trial court judges recognizing that we need expanded absentee voter opportunities, but turned back by courts of appeals and the United States Supreme Court refusing to intervene and refusing to restore these decisions by trial judges. We'll be taking those cases to trial. All of those cases were for the primary. Now we're taking those cases to trial for the general election. So we will not stop fighting in the courts to expand absentee voter opportunities. But at the same time, we know that many of our voters want to vote in person, and that means voting in person means ensuring that the polling place itself is clean, that our voters have PPE. I have called on Black churches to take responsibility for ensuring that every voter has a mask and has gloves on election day in November. It means being prepared well in advance of the election so that you know what's on the ballot, so you don't have to spend a whole lot of time in the voting booth. And like Congresswoman Sewell said, we're really demanding that everyone vote not only this election day, but vote for every office that's on the ballot. Yes, the presidential election is monumentally important, but so is the sheriff election, the school board election, the town council election, the judicial election. It's time for Black people to stop leaving power on the table. We have to vote in every election for every office. And we also need to organize. And there could be no better person to help us think through how we organize in advance of this election than our friend and dear colleague, LaTosha Brown, the co-founder of Black Voters Matter. She's doing some highfalutin stuff up at Harvard University now as well, but she is the person that we go to really talk through how we organize at the local level, particularly in the South. We follow her voice and her inspiration. I'm so glad she's with us today, LaTosha Brown.
We're not used to seeing her sit still. Normally she's in the street somewhere.
We like the streets. You know, unfortunately, my being in the streets in Kentucky election led me to catching COVID. And so because of that, I have been very mindful around, as we're talking about, it is real, y'all. Like, we have to recognize that it is real. And that's why it's even that so much more important that we're actually educating our people on what's needed. But I want to go back to what my sister Sherilyn, I'm so glad that she is on the front lines fighting on the court and the courts with us, because I do think that part of what how we gain power has to be, we have to approach this from multiple points, right? And we have access points that we have to approach this. But what I think is critical and key is organizing. That there is a particular unique moment that we're in right now. That right now we're on the afternoon of, in this country, we saw the largest uprising of people ever in the history of America. Multiracial, multi-generational, right? All around the country, in all 50 states, there was a protest. There was an uprising that was centered around this conversation around Black Lives Matter, and which was really in response to the murder that we all witnessed of George Floyd. I'm raising that because I think I have to know what time it is. You know, Reverend C.T. Vivian was a mentor of mine who we recently lost. And I remember one of the things that he would always say is he would always talk about, there was mobilization, but then sister, there's organization. And so I think we have to really recognize in this moment that we need organization, that we've got to support. We can't just depend on, well, this process and telling people to go vote, or even those that are listening are voting for them to go vote. But everybody has to be deputized. At this point, we've got all Black folks need to be deputized and need to see themselves responsible for at least 10 voters. I usually say 5, but I feel it's critical right now. I'm gonna say 10 voters that we actually have to, from our family members to those around us, we have got to make sure that we are literally stepping into this space, this transformational moment, and really using our agency to build power for our community. The second thing that I want to say is I think it's really important that this conversation, as we're talking about COVID-19, that even as Black Voters Matter, we've been doing our work, it hasn't been just centered around voting. It has to be around power. That unfortunately, over the years, what has happened, the conversation of Black people voting has been centered around the participation. Yes, for us to participate, but not necessarily in connecting this about power. We have to connect our vote to getting power. We not only need to make sure that we have someone new in the White House, but we need the US Senate. You know, we need all the down ballots, all of the women that are running for office and progressive candidates. Right now, our community has been particularly hard hit by COVID-19 in terms of, I have one person on Organize I work with in Southwest Georgia who has lost 7 first cousins for COVID-19 in the last 3 months. It is real. And right now on the brink of that, as we're talking about the biggest health pandemic that we've experienced, there is a hospital in Southwest Georgia, which was a place that was ground zero at one point from the virus, that is scheduled to close in the next 30 days, which means that we've got to put pressure on these governors, these Southern governors that have refused to expand ACA. We've got to put pressure or remove them, that ultimately that we can no longer just adapt to what is at the strength of, I love what my brother, Derek, who's leading NAACP, we done dying. I so love that phrase, because we are done dying. That ultimately this is a new moment and we've got to take advantage of this. The third and the last point that I raised is the significance of the South. And you know, I like to tell people, welcome to the South, y'all. That ultimately, when we're looking at, you can be as progressive as you want to in California and New York, but ultimately, who is setting the policy priorities in this country right now? They're from Kentucky, they're from South Carolina, they're Southern senators that we've actually abdicated our role in our power, where Black folks are living in the South, and we've let those seats go unchallenged. This is a moment for us to reframe and rethink, have a radical reimagining of how we engage in this process that is not just about participation, but it's about power. And so since I'm talking about the South, there's no way that you can actually talk about the South and organizing in the South and building power in the South without mentioning the name of my brother, Derek Johnson, who now is the 19th president, who now leads the NAACP. But I know him as a fierce warrior on the ground, that we have been in many a foxhole of really fighting voter suppression and getting
people to vote. So I'm going to turn it over to you, my brother, Derek Johnson.
All right. Thank you, Latasha. Thank you, Congresswoman Sewell, for inviting me to join this panel. It's unique for many of us who were in Selma in March, and we had the privilege, the opportunity to hear the words from Congressman John Lewis when he said, "We must vote like we've never voted before." And for me, it was surreal. It was surreal because thinking about the relationships in the civil rights movement, Latasha and I, we were on a campaign in 2000 in Selma. And that campaign was about a mayor's election because Joe Smitherman was the mayor of Selma in 1965 when John Lewis, with all that courage, sought to cross the bridge. And he remained mayor until 2000. He remained mayor to 2000 because vote suppression was real in the town of Selma. He remained mayor in that time in that city that was about 70% African American because people didn't understand, respect the value of down ballot races, local elections. All politics are local. And so as the campaign slogan was in 2000, Joe must go, Latasha and I was there. And if you project
and
out.
so am I, I'm a citizen of Selma too.
That's right.
Joe must go.
Joe must go, right? But it was electrifying to see the energy in that town when people had hope. And what we need to do as civil rights activists, as community leaders and elected officials, begin to address the hope of the future and not talk about the negative that's around us, because the negative can only be overcome with the hope. Vote suppression can be addressed 3 different ways. Policy change. But I don't foresee any policy change before November's election. Legal action. Both Cheryl and Kristen, they will take all measures necessary through legal actions to ensure we have access to voting. But the most important way to address vote suppression is vote turnout. And vote turnout is how we're going to win in November. However we define winning. All of us here are nonpartisan organizations, but we also are organizations that work to ensure that our communities have full, unfettered access to the ballot box. That's the role that we all must play. Leadership is local. Strategy is something we should be leaning into, but most importantly, voter turnout in November must be driven by messages of hope. We are done dying and public policy is killing us. Therefore, we must take the power in our own hand to inform how policymakers or which policymakers will be sitting in the seat, moving from protest in the street to power at the ballot box, to public policy change to address structural and systemic racism. That is the trajectory that we must be on. Elections cannot be seen in the one moment transaction. Protest is necessary but not sufficient, and we must move towards public policy impact so that whether it is implementation, reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, or looking at a more comprehensive approach to open up access to voting. As effective as the Voting Rights Act was when it was passed in 1965, it was still a compromise bill. So we must reauthorize Section 5 and Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act as we look broader to ensure that the next set of elections, we won't be confronted with these type of problems. That is policymaker action, whether it's state or federal. And for the NAACP, we want to move towards that type of conversation. But in order for us to move to that conversation, turnout in November is going to be key. Access to voting. Why should we be confronted with those horrific pictures in Milwaukee, knowing that's going to be reality for so many people in November, where people are standing in line and they have to choose between their right to vote and their health? That's not only inhumane, it should not exist. That only exists because you have a number of precincts that were closed in the city of Milwaukee. We should look at the allocations of precincts the same way we look at redistricting. Each county should have equal weight and access to precincts based on the population of that county, a weighted strategy. We also know in Atlanta, when Stacey Abrams was on the ballot, you have polling places to open, and Chris and I, we identified one, and the cores were not in the polling place, so they could not exercise the vote. Or in some precincts, you simply didn't have enough voting machines. Allocations of voting machines should be very similar to a rated strategy like we do in redistricting, so there's equal access to the number of machines in those polling places by county. We should also be looking at this concept of getting off work and driving past polling place after polling place after polling place till you get to your assigned precincts. Restricted polling places, it's unnecessary, and it is a vote suppression method, just like voter registration. Same-day voter registration should be in place, but restricted polling places should be done away with. And far too many counties are still utilizing touchscreen machines that were purchased after the 2000 elections. How many people still use a computer that's almost 20 years old? That's unheard of. We need to phase out those machines and go to ADA compliant machines where we have the security and the convenience of the instant count, but a paper ballot backup so we can audit the returns and guarantee that the will of the voters are heard. Those type of structural electoral changes is what we need to move to through public policy reform, but we cannot get the public policy reform if we don't leverage our power at the ballot box in November. And that leveraging that power must be with a value proposition that we are all created equal, that our franchise should be valued equally, and we gotta move from protest, which is a necessary energy, to power at the ballot box. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Christian Clark, the head of the Loras Committee for Civil Rights. And a beautiful thing about starting the story with our relationship with Latasha, Joe Must Go in 2000, actually Latasha and I knew each other when we were both in undergrad, to Christian Clark and her journey from being an LDF to the New York Attorney General office to this seat now. It is a wonderful community that we're part of. We must move away from the scarcity mentality. We got to understand that social justice is not a competition and that we all have a role to play. Christian Clark, take it away.
Thanks so much, Derek. And thanks so much to Congresswoman Sewell for having this conversation right now. It is so incredibly important and timely. Grateful for your work and your leadership, and especially for doing the important work to move HR 4 to the finish line. There were a lot of bills in Congress, but HR 4 is by far one of the most important. So thank you for doing the hard work to restore our nation's Voting Rights Act. We're going to keep pushing and keep fighting it until we get it all the way to the finish line. And it's always an honor and a privilege and a blessing to be with Sherilyn and Latasha and Derek. So grateful to be in the trenches with you doing this work and fighting for racial justice each and every day. Everybody laid the groundwork, and I actually want to do some work connecting the dots, because this season we actually have a lot of work to do, not just with respect to the vote and getting our folks out to vote during the pandemic, but we've got a related issue, the census. And this administration is fighting at every turn to make sure that our communities of color, are not counted. And we're running out of time on this battle. It is truly critical that we work to make sure that Black folks, that young Black children and Black families get counted in the 2020 census. Why? Because we've got billions of federal funding, billions of dollars in federal funding that get allocated based on those numbers, based on that data. So this is really critical. Then why does that census data matter? That matters because after we catch our breath from this election cycle, we're going to be gearing up for the next round of redistricting. And that's where maps for your city council, your school board, your state legislature, Congress get redrawn. Once every decade, elected officials go to work and reopen those maps to make sure that there are equal populations, et cetera. And they use census data. So if Black folks are not counted, we will lose out in this next round of redistricting. And then let's link it back to the right to vote. We are actually going to the polls in November and putting in place the people who are going to be redrawing those maps. Our city councilmen, the school board members, the state legislative, these are the folks who will be going in and doing the work to ensure that we have fair maps that fairly reflect the power of our communities. So I just want to make sure that we understand that there is a lot of work to do, but kind of a trifecta when it comes to our democracy. Now, we're having this conversation as people are continuing to march and protest and are demanding a response to the crisis of racial justice and police violence and white supremacy and issues that have torn at the fabric of our country for far too long. But this actually is a unique moment for us to link up these racial justice issues that we care so deeply about to the power of our vote, the power of our ballot. As people are pressing and demanding justice on the ground in local communities, we actually have another important pressure point that can be applied, and that's at the ballot box on Election Day. So what am I talking about here? If you care about what's happening at your local police department, let's appreciate that our mayors who are elected are the ones who are often deciding who serves as the police chief in your community. Hold them accountable on Election Day. Our district attorneys, elected individuals who make decisions about whether or not to prosecute that cop who used deadly force against a Black person without basis. Hold that person accountable on Election Day. Sheriffs, another elected position. Sheriffs are actually the ones who run the jails, and they're making decisions on things like solitary confinement, on things like whether or not we're going to release nonviolent people being penned up in jails in the midst of a raging pandemic. Hold that person accountable on Election Day. I think this season it's critical that we take our march from the streets to the polls come November 3rd. And we've got some work to do between now and November 3rd. One, we've got to make sure that everybody in our network is registered to vote. With people confined to their homes and not going to church, now not out on college campuses, we've got to make sure that people have taken the steps to actually get registered to vote. Every presidential election year is actually when we see the greatest numbers of people who are not yet registered brought onto the registration rolls. So do some work after this convening today to make sure that everybody you know is actually registered. 2, make a plan to vote. Do you know what the rules are for absentee voting in your state? Do you know the deadline for requesting an absentee ballot if they're not automatically sending you one? Now's the time to take steps to figure out, are you going to vote absentee? Then what do I got to do? Am I going to vote during early voting when it's available in my state? Then what have I got to do? And if I'm going to go out and vote in person on Election Day, am I ready? Do I know the hours and the time for voting and where I've got to go to vote? How can you get access to this information? We run a program at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law called Election Protection. This is the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. And tons of organizations across the country, including many of my friends here, are part of the coalition. It's anchored by the 866 Our Vote hotline, 866 Our Vote. Put it on your speed dial. Share it with your networks. If you have questions, call us 365 days a year to make sure that you are empowered with the information that you need to successfully have your vote heard this election season. The final thing that I'm going to say is the U.S. Postal Service. We've got to keep our eye on what's happening there. Again, President Trump is bent on turning this agency on its head at such a crucial moment. We are relying on the Postal Service each and every day to make sure that in the midst of the pandemic, people are getting access to medication, getting access to benefits. But we're also relying on the Postal Service because they play a central role this election season. There's a new head, a new boss in town, a former Trump mega donor who's already making incredible changes. He's eliminated overtime. He's stripping local post offices of the machines that they need to sort mail. So we've got to keep an eye on what's happening on our local postal office. If you are experiencing delays, we want you to sound an alarm. It is critical that the Postal Service do its part and timely deliver mail this season. With that, giving the baton back to my good friend, Roland Martin. Roland, thank you so much for all the work that you do every day to make sure that our stories and our struggle is told.
I certainly appreciate it, Christian. Thanks a lot. All right, folks, let's jump right into it. Everything y'all laid out, is certainly on point. And the reality is, and anyone can jump in here, people need to understand this is a targeted attack. This is a targeted attack. We've seen this for the longest, but we really saw this thing ramp up after the midterm elections in 2010, then went to a whole new level after the Shelby v. Holder decision. And that's really where we are. This is a targeted attempt, not just at African Americans, but at young people and in some cases, older voters as well. And so anybody can jump in on that point.
I want to jump in. I just want to thank our panelists again. I want to start where you are, what you just suggested, because old battles have become new again. Now, I know that John Lewis and other foot soldiers thought that when we got the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68, we were on a roll and we were rolling towards equality. The reality is that every generation must fight to sustain the gains and the progress that we've made and to push it forward. We saw after the Shelby versus Holder decision, restrictive voting. No longer do you have to count how many marbles are in a jar. No longer do you have to recite the 67 counties of the state of Alabama to register to vote. But let's make no mistake about it. It was a concerted effort to put up barriers to voting. And it's our job collectively to tear down those barriers. I know that in Congress, we as policymakers can only push so much. We know that rarely does public policy changes occur in the halls of Congress. They are pushed up through grassroots activism. That's why having Latasha and Derek on this line and making sure that we have, Cheryl and Kristen on this panel. Because when you think about it, it's about the legal actions, it's about the grassroots actions, and it's about public policy. And it's also about you, Roland. You as a journalist are about amplifying our voices. So I am so excited about today's panel because I think that we have all the parts that we need, but we have to stress, as Kristen said, that we have to have a plan to vote this time. The fact that we have passed legislation that's sitting languishing on the desk of Mitch McConnell, everything from H.R. 4, rename the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020, but we also have the USPS Fairness Act, which was about putting more resources into our postal service. That passed the House. We also passed the HEROES Act, which gave billions of dollars for election assistance to the state levels to institute vote by mail, because we do know that we're safer voting from home. But no truer words were said than we have to have a plan. You got to know how you're going to vote this time. You got to know whether your name has been purged off the rolls or not. You got to know your deadlines. You know, in the state of Alabama, in the midst of this pandemic, you still have to apply for an absentee ballot. There is no, when you apply, you have to check a box as to an excuse for why you have that absentee ballot. And oh, by the way, when you're safer at home, they're also telling you have to have a photocopy of your ID, your voter ID, in your absentee application. And when you get your ballot, you got to have 2 witnesses to it. These are the kind of modern day barriers, that we're fighting against, and we can only do it by being informed.
Natasha, Derek, point I say is targeted is because when you start breaking all those different things down, the whole intent is to shave off a few here, a few here, a few here. But the reality is when you look at the election in 2016, Donald Trump wins by 78,000 votes. Voter ID had been approved in Wisconsin. The Obama Department of Justice approved the voter ID there, but here's what happened. The federal judge called Governor Scott Walker's office in and said, why are y'all dragging your feet on issuing the voter ID? So even though they had the voter ID, they were slow at issuing the voter IDs. These are the types of things that are being targeted at these key constituencies?
Be clear, elections it's a game of inches, not miles. And so the goal is to win by fractions of percentages of points. But it didn't start in 2010. I'm a Star Wars fan. You know, much of the success of the Voting Rights Act, you could begin to see the peak of Clinton versus Jeffords in the 80s. And then in the 90s, I call it the Empire Struck Back. And we see Reno Shaw and the Bolger decision. You go through the contract on America, you come to the 2000s, the continuation of the erosion of the application of the Voting Rights Act. You get to the 2008 election cycle, you begin to see the step up of the concept of voter ID, call it in jurisdictions that lack voter ID, voter fraud, much of the language that was used during the period we call the redemption period. You fast forward to 2010 when they got control of the legislative bodies. And they also got control of the court and struck that ultimate blow with the case out of Alabama, Reno Shaw. But in the midst of all of that, whether it was redistricting, access to precincts, precinct locations, the composition of the voter roll, who's purged, who's not, voter ID in some jurisdictions, voter ID not in other jurisdictions, it is always consistent with the freedom song that freedom is a constant struggle. And that even when we win, we must protect what we have gained. Because if we don't protect what we have gained, people would take it. Voting is currency in a democracy. And people are always trying to take the currency so they can get control of the power. And that power is about the money. Who's taxed, who's not taxed, and how those tax dollars are spent.
Roland, I wanna really emphasize what Derek just said, because, you know, I was a lawyer on Jeffords versus Clinton. I've been litigating in the voting rights space for a very long time. And one of the things that was so unique and important about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was that if you read the Senate report that accompanied Section 5 when it was passed in 1965, and you read why they created this preclearance requirement, what the Senate said was it was trying to get at existing practices that discriminated against Black people and kept them from voting. But the Senate specifically said that it was also designed to get at ingenious practices that might be created in the future. In other words, they even knew in 1965.
Right.
Great activist Charles Sherrod once told me, which is that racism is a shapeshifter. They knew that it wouldn't look exactly the same in every incarnation. They knew that the desire for white supremacy would remain, but that it would show up in different ways. And that's why Section 5 was so ingenious. So when you talk about the targeting right now, when we look at things like the voter ID law, you remember the one in Texas that Kristen and I challenged.
I'm native Texan, I remember it very well.
You couldn't use your tribal ID. Our clients who were students at HBCUs or Prairie View A&M could no longer use their student ID, right? You couldn't use certain kinds of government employee ID because they ascertained that we were more likely to be government employees, but you could use your concealed gun carry permit. You remember the North Carolina omnibus voter suppression bill, and the Court of Appeals saying that the provisions of that bill were created with surgical precision to target Black and brown voters. The reason it's important to raise those two pieces of voter suppression is because they came before Trump. And to the extent people are thinking that this is just about Trump, they need to understand, as Derek said, that this is about power and this is about white supremacy. And that's what the voting rights movement has always been about. It is about the desire to maintain white control. And so if we understand that, then we understand the targeting, right? Then we understand who is going to be targeted. And it's vital that we understand that because a lot of the conversation right now has descended into a partisan conversation. You know, Democrats versus Republicans. And there's no question that there is a very intense partisan dimension to it. But at our peril, we forget the racial dimension that is here. When they talk about suppressing votes, they know precisely whose votes they want to suppress. And it is the votes of Black and brown people, of Native Americans, of Asian Americans. And so our response to that targeting has to be, you serve it up, we hit it, right? You serve up ID, we come with full force. You serve up polling place changes, we come with full force. You serve it up with absentee ballot restrictions, we come with full force. And that's why it's vital that Derek talked about not thinking about a position of lack. There are enough of us and enough organizations working together to create a united front that can manage this targeting. Just like the post office, I know we're all reading the stories. Do not think that there are not many of us who are engaged in deep study, figuring out how we're going to deal with this issue. We're not going to sit back and simply allow our votes to be taken from us and allow our votes to be suppressed. But what this means is that everyone has to see themselves as playing a role, ears open, reporting what they hear, being fully prepared. Everybody talked about the plan. We call ours prepared to vote. You got to be prepared to vote. You can't wake up on election morning this year and say, you know what? Now I feel like I'm going to vote. No, you have to have known days before what you were going to do.
Yep.
And that extends to that all those races down ballot. When I say that we need you to vote for the school board election and the sheriff election and the town council and the district attorney, I don't mean that you walk in that booth and you just flick one because you see a D or an R next to the name, or because you think it sounds like a Black person or a Latino person. I mean, you spent the Sunday before election day, or hopefully 2 Sundays before election day, educating yourself. What is the power of the sheriff? What is the power of the DA? What has this candidate said about what they're going to do with that power? We are leaving too much of our power on the table. And it means we have to vote. It means we have to be educated. And it means we have to be prepared to hold them to account. Last thing, this year, because we are so encouraging people to absentee vote, we may not know the outcome of many of these races on election night. And in our community, that means we have to prepare ourselves for the long battle. There is likely to be litigation happening in the days after the election. And we need, as a community, to be mature enough to be patient and to be prepared to let every single vote be counted and to allow this to play out in the way that it must play out. Pay attention to what we are saying. Follow us on social media, listen to what we're saying, so you'll have good information and understand what should be happening on November 3rd, but also in the days following November 3rd, when there may be contentious negotiations and litigation unfolding, especially because so many of us will be voting absentee.
Latasha, you've seen this. This is about frustrating people. This is about getting people so frustrated where they just say, you know what? I'm just not even going to waste my time with it. When you talk about the shutting down of voting locations or moving of locations, purging of folks from the voter rolls as well. And so you've been out there traveling on that Black Voters Matter bus all up and down the eastern seaboard and the Southwest. What have you been hearing directly from folks on the ground? And what have y'all been saying to them to get them to understand they can't be frustrated? They got to jump over those hurdles.
I think that one of the things that is also a form of voter suppression that we don't talk about is creating a culture of fear and confusion, right? That part of it, and to actually get people to be so feel so discombobulated about the process that they want to disengage. So that's why I think it's even more critical that Black-led organizations, that grassroots groups are empowered in this moment, because oftentimes they're the groups that are going to be on the front lines doing the work. When we think about, I often talk about groups like NAACP and organizations like the Black Lives Matter chapters and those local groups. Those are the groups that are always there, that they are always embedded in our communities. We have to find ways right now that we're actually empowering them, that we're investing our dollars in them, that we're volunteering with them, because actually that's our biggest protection. Because part of what winds up happening, I saw this in Selma, I've seen this all throughout the space, that there is this culture of fear, that if they can create this culture of fear, people will engage. If they can create this culture of confusion, right? I have been a part of elections where there were literally flyers passed out that said, make sure you go to vote on Wednesday. That was passed out, that were created by folks who wanted to throw Black folks off. I got phone calls on my cell phone right now from the 2017 election, where the Frederick Douglass Society in Alabama that nobody's ever heard was actually trying to push a message to be supportive to a Republican candidate, or to a candidate that was running that didn't have an agenda that was aligned with the Black community. The bottom line is these tricks have always been used to make us get disengaged. Even now, when we talk about, this Kanye West is running for president, I don't talk a lot about that, because I think that we, sometimes we lift up stuff that is not critically important, but I do think that it speaks to something that I really want to raise around how not just only racism, but that sexism becomes an issue, because we are now dealing with a ticket that is going to have a Black woman as vice president. We cannot underestimate how there is going to be a concerted effort of folks to go after Black men and really be able to use this message to say, to really be able to disconnect them from what is happening in our community, to actually talk to them with bells and whistles around the economic issues and what their concern is around the economic issues. We've got to be real clear that in this moment, we are empowering the messengers, not just making sure that we have a clear message, but that we are empowering the messengers. And so in doing that, I encourage everybody, anybody's listening here, you got to vote, but you got to do more than vote. You got to vote. You got to find you 10 people that you're engaged in, and you've got to find a political home. I don't care what organization you join, from SCLC to NAACP to Black Voters Matter to NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, whatever organization, you have to find a political home. This is not the time for us to operate as individuals. We have to use our collective power. And in doing so, we have to organize and support those groups, and particularly those local grassroots groups that are doing this work on the ground. Roland, to come just to briefly say with your question of what I've been hearing from people, what is really interesting is what I saw in Georgia. One of the polling sites I went to in Georgia, it was so egregious. It took me 3 hours to vote. But even later that evening, and 10:30 at night, when I was getting ready to go to bed, we got a phone call. There were 300 Black people still in line in Union City that we actually went out. The last voter didn't vote until 12:37 a.m. on Wednesday, right? What was really profound to me is not a single person left that line. That there were folks that were out there. There's a certain kind of energy and a spirit of Black folks that are resisting right now. It's not fair that we should have to wait or we should have to go through this, but we've got to tap into that current and that energy and support that. We've got to support young organizers. We've got to support people, recruit folks to be poll workers. I think it's important that we recognize that we've got to show up differently. We don't have the luxury just to show up as a voter. I mean, that's the bare minimum. We've got to vote, but we also have to show up like we are literally on the front lines being deputized to fight for our community.
The most beautiful thing I've seen the last 10 days is the energy of Black women. They have been convening on Zoom calls. They've been multiple conference calls. I think Tuesday night, it was a 3-hour YouTube conversation. I mean, that type of energy.
No, that was 4 hours. We live streamed on Roland Martin Unfiltered. It was 4 hours. They went from 8 to midnight.
Look, that's what's encouraging to me, because it's from our Black women that inspire the necessary hope and energy to move us to the polls. And if we have this level of energy, we can defeat whatever's confronting us, but most importantly, we can define the way forward. That's what I'm most proud about in this moment, that level of energy. It's been the energy to sustain our organizations. It's been the type of energy to sustain our churches. It's been the energy to drive the agenda in the Black community. And so, Roland, you and I, we must own it, support it, and acknowledge it.
And now that we African-American women, we're going to be out there even more.
So, Christian, the reason we've heard this from several people, planning, and that is what often happens during this time period. We always say, we got to vote. Well, first of all, you got to be registered before you actually vote. And because of purging, you got to make sure that you double check to make sure that you're still on the rolls, which means that you're planning that. Then it's okay, fine. What's the beginning of early voting where you are? If you choose to vote by mail, what's the beginning of that? Now we got the whole deal with the post office. Some people are saying they're going to request their ballot. They're going to physically drop it off. And so as a part of the messaging, Christian, we have to be letting folks know that you must be planning ahead of time. I keep telling folks, do not wait to what Sherilyn said. Don't wait to vote on election day, because you might as well expect 6, 8, 10 hour long lines. But we must be pushing people to plan ahead and drive that message home.
Yeah, now's the time. Now is the time. It is September, right? This election is right around the corner. So we've got work to do. It's not just registering, it's making sure everyone around you is registered. It's not just you know, making sure that you've got your game plan. It's making sure that your grandma has a game plan for voting this election season. We know that this pandemic is hitting the elderly disproportionately more so than others. And we just got to be on alert. You know, we're used to struggle as Black people. There are all kinds of 11th hour shenanigans that, you know, we see from time to time when it comes to hostile officials who want to lock us out of the ballot box. So we got to keep our eye on what's happening. Purging of the registration rolls, shutting down polling sites are all some of the things that we tend to see on the heels of elections. So doing the work to get ready now is key. And it's not just the presidency that's on the line or on the ballot this election season. So doing a little bit of work to understand who's running in your local communities and making sure that you can cast an informed ballot all the way down is really key. One of the things that's very remarkable when you look from state to state is to see the drop off, the major drop off. Too many people just go in, hit that one button at the top and ignore everything else on that ballot, right? But so much power really starts at the local level in the places where we go to sleep at night. So doing some work to understand what's on the ballot or the ballot initiatives is also really, really critical. And that 866 Our Vote number that I mentioned earlier, the election protection hotline, is a great tool that you can use to get access to information right now.
This whole deal,
Roland, let me just add, can I just add that
yeah.
health issue associated with this also that's really important? Kristen talked about ballot measures, you know, ballot initiatives being on the ballot. When you're not ready and you haven't looked at the ballot, and the first time you're looking at the ballot is when you enter that vote, you are the person who ends up spending 15 minutes in the voting booth. You shouldn't want to spend 15 minutes in the voting booth at any time, but you certainly shouldn't during a COVID-19 pandemic. So part of what we've been saying as part of our Prepared to Vote campaign is that's the stuff that needs to be read the Sunday before or the week before. You know, those long ballot initiatives that are about funding the library or providing other bond issues to support various public works. When you spend all the time reading that constitutional amendment in the voting booth for the first time, that is more time you have to spend exposing yourself. So this year, even thinking about preparation is about making sure you've seen that ballot before you go into the voting booth, so that when you go in, you know what you're doing. You know who you're voting for president. You know who you're voting for governor. You know who you're voting for DA, school board. You know whether you're voting for the bond amendment or not. This is really a time for us to gather ourselves in the weeks before the election and really treat it like a job and fully prepare ourselves to go in there so that we can, if you're voting in person, you can get in and you can get out. That contributes to the long lines when we have people who have to spend 15 minutes in the voting booth because they're looking at the ballot for the first time.
Latasha made this point, and anyone can jump in. Look, my parents are 73 years old. They work polls constantly. Look, they were working the Texas runoff recently, and even in the midst of COVID. And so they're gonna be there in November. But also, I think we got to remind folks, these are paid positions. I think we can be reminding young folks, hey, you can work the polls. This ain't just a volunteer thing. A lot of these, they're paid. And so these are jobs. And so that's also, I think, a messaging deal that we have to be stating. Every time I hear people talk about a shortage of poll workers, a lot of people don't bring up the fact that these are actually paid opportunities.
Also have paid census workers and census takers as well. We really have to empower ourselves.
Yeah, and we need younger poll workers. We don't want to be in a position, we don't know, none of us knows what's going to happen with COVID in October and early November. There could be an uptick in various places in various regions. We could lose a lot of the people who normally are poll workers. Mostly we're used to seeing elderly people work in that poll. Let's protect our own community. We don't want to expose our elders to this pandemic. So we really do need younger people to take on deciding that they're going to work as poll workers this year. I've been seeing in Maryland, 1,000 poll workers, that were down. We should be able to handle this and resolve it. This is another thing, Roland, that the Black churches should be putting out that call for people to sign up to work as poll workers. And you're absolutely right. These are paid positions. We need all hands on deck. And that is something you can do. That way, if people call out, they don't have to close the polling place because they have nobody to man the polling place. Yet another place where we could really help.
I do want to get into the voting by mail deal because the folks at Vice, they've done lots of reporting on this, and they dropped a story that said that that in some of these mail locations, they literally are being ordered to shut down ballot sorting machines. So we've had lots of people who have been saying, hey, let's vote by mail. We see what Trump is doing with the Postal Service. Okay, so what's our response to that? Because there are people who say, I want to vote by mail, but if you're having a very clear, it's undeniable attempt to completely slow that down, to keep folks from voting by mail, what do we now tell our people? Anybody can jump in.
So go ahead, Christian.
What's happening at the Postal Service should have everyone outraged, not just Black, but every American should be outraged at the sabotage of the U.S. Postal Service that is underway. This is an institution that has existed for over 200 years. It employs many people of color and women. And here we are in 2020, seeing this president hijack the agency for his own political ends. Everyone should be outraged. If you live in a city, if you live in a rural area, we rely on the Postal Service for timely getting mail out through snow, rain, or sleet. That is literally, those are words literally embodied in the mission of the agency. I think it is really critical that Congress do its part to hold oversight hearings right now on what's happening inside the Postal Service. We've got somebody at the helm, Louis DeJoy, who hasn't spent a day working in the Postal Service, doesn't know what he's doing. And the first thing that he does is he clears out his top deputies, he clears out leadership. He's moved over 24 officials at the top and is making outrageous decisions, like what you just said, Roland, moving sorting equipment out in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a moment where they are contending with volumes of mail that are unprecedented. The U.S. Postal Service is being weaponized right now to undermine and obstruct vote by mail. It is plain as day, and every American should be sounding an alarm about this.
So what do we tell our people though who are watching this? Congress can hold the oversight hearings, but he's still doing what he's doing. So what is our messaging to our people, Derek?
First of all, election is a state-by-state legal reality. There is no federal vote by mail requirement as we sit here today. There will more than likely not be an agreement by the House and the Senate to have a comprehensive vote by mail reality. So all of the people who are listening must understand what is the legal standard for your state, whether it's absentee ballots. What are the requirements? Who's eligible? And how can you cast those ballots? In some states, it's much more difficult because you have to request and then receive application and before you get the ballots. In other states, if you are over 65, you can go in and you can cast it on the spot, but it differs state by state. So the first thing people must know is, what does the state law say as it relates to how you can cast a ballot? And then secondly, in that process, figure out how can it be done and with your health in mind. We want to make sure where there are states where you can have early votings, people go and vote early so your ballot can be cast in location if there are no lines, that you're not putting yourself at risk. In other states, if you can vote by absentee ballot because you meet one of the criterias, do so, especially if you are already on an approved list. But it truly is a state-by-state reality. What they're doing to the Postal Service is outrageous. But what's going to happen in November, we're going to have to rely on what the state laws say in the individual states we live in and navigate from there.
So Roland, I just want to say three things. There's just three recommendations here. So one is, people who can early vote should use early voting, right?
That's right.
Who need to vote absentee and want to vote absentee should vote absentee, absolutely. If they are in a state that has drop boxes for the absentee vote, use the drop box. Most absentee votes can either be sent through the mail or you can bring the ballot itself to the state election board. So you can drop it off at the state election board, or there are places where they have drop boxes. Now, of course, the Trump campaign is suing about drop boxes too, but that's a scurrilous lawsuit. So you can also drop off the absentee ballots. But then also be aware that you should expect that, as I said earlier, we're not going to accept this lying down. There are going to be lawsuits about whatever is happening with the Postal Service once we are able to confirm precisely what is happening within the Postal Service as it relates to ballots. There's also going to be litigation that's going to try and extend the time in which those ballots can be received to account for the slowdowns that they are trying to create at this moment so that those ballots can be counted. So you're going to see a lot happening over the next few weeks. Now, it is true that the legislation, looks very, it looks pretty ominous in terms of whether there'll be legislation to provide additional financial support to the post office. But that does not mean that every single person listening to this should not be reaching out to both of their senators and to their House members. Because at the end of the day, they have the power, including, especially, frankly, the Republicans, to pull the president's coattails on this. There are people in rural Kentucky who don't want the mail to be slowed down because they need their prescriptions, because they need their Social Security check, because they need their stimulus check, because they need other services through the post office. There are people in rural parts of Maryland, people in rural parts of West Virginia who don't want the post office to be slowed down. And so this should be a matter of activism for everyone. The Senate, and House members may be in recess. What they call that is that's their district time. That means that's a good time for you to reach them at their district office in their states. You should be reaching out to them. You should be adding them on Twitter. You should be posting on Facebook. You should be sending letters. You should be calling their office and telling them, hands off the United States Post Office. And that means that should be 50 states across the board. And don't believe that it doesn't make a difference. Trump is able to do what he is allowed to get away with. And there has to be pressure on on the coterie of people who surround him, especially those who are up for election, to compel them to make him take his hands off the United States Postal Service.
We've got to vote early. The key in this process is early, that we have to vote early and push the idea of voting early. So if there are problems, we have a time to actually adjust that. So
last, we've got a few minutes left. Last question for all of you. And I'm going to call on you individually. I'll start with you, Christian. Everybody has a role to play, lane to play. And so how are y'all communicating and what are you communicating to the folks? So is it the voter protection number? Are you sending out e-blasts or text messages or whatever, giving people updates on dates and of registration deadlines and early voting deadlines and those things? How are you communicating these things to your audience?
Well, the amazing thing is that for the organizations doing this work, all the organizations here, we work closely. We work hand in hand every day in doing this work and carrying out this fight. But one thing that we want people to do right now is to plug that 866 Our Vote number into your speed dial. The rules vary state by state on early voting and absentee voting, and in-person voting will look different in every state across the country. So if you're having trouble accessing accurate information about the state of play in your state, call that number right now. It's a trusted source of accurate, nonpartisan information. We're just all about making sure that Black people, that all people can have their voice heard this election season. And you can also visit the 866ourvote.org website for more information.
All right. Christian Clark, we certainly appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Derek?
The NAACP, we have a relational organizing model. We're recruiting volunteers to join on. Our target goal of organizers is 200,000. We've enrolled 70,000 so far. It is getting frequent voters to contact infrequent voters in your community. We are doing away with people parachuting into our community trying to convince us to go vote. We need to be organized in our own community, neighbor to neighbor contact. NAACP.org/volunteer. Once you sign up, we will ask you to volunteer to talk to your neighbor. We've already mapped out those individuals that we are communicating with. For the last 3 weeks, we've already sent 1.3 text messages. We are kicking off our virtual phone bank now so we can enroll volunteers. NAACP.org/volunteer.
Cheryl and Eiffel?
At the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, our Prepared to Vote campaign launches every year. We insist that there are elections not every 4 years, but every year. You go on our website and you can find palm cards that give you all the information about voting in your jurisdiction in the South. In addition, if you wish to volunteer to be part of our poll watching and poll worker on the ground crew, you can email us at vote@naacpldf.org. That's vote@naacpldf.org. You can follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, follow me on Twitter. Go to our website, www.naacpldf.org. We try to make sure that you have good, solid, reliable information. There are always links to our partners in the work so that you can understand what they are doing. But this is the time to get yourself informed and make sure that you know trusted sources of information so that when you start hearing the noise, you know where to go to get real answers.
Shirley, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Latasha.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching out to freedom's land. People can text us, Black Voters Matter Fund, because Black voters do matter. Text 797979, text We Matter to 797979. Visit our website, Black Voters Matter Fund. We're active on social media. Thank you all. We'll meet you all on the ground. Come on, y'all. Let's go.
Yeah, because you knew I was going to ask you to sing. So, yeah, you got ahead of that. All right, then, Congresswoman Terry Sewell closes out.
I think communication and communicating how we can come up with a voting plan and voting early is critically important. Having trusted messengers, and that's why I'm so grateful to all of our panelists today for being trusted messengers, getting the word out in your various organizations and all that you do to uplift our community. You know, it's my honor every day to represent Alabama's 7th District, Birmingham, Montgomery, and my hometown of Selma, and 9 counties of the Black Belt. It's my home district. I know what's possible when you have resources and opportunities. And I hope to uplift the people of my district, but just as important, the legacy of my district. And so voting rights is that legacy. And I make the solemn promise that I will continue, as long as there's breath in me and a place in Congress for me, that I will continue to fight to fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In closing, I want to also just say that our website, sewell.house.gov, is a great source of information about voting in Alabama, but also about coronavirus, how to get tested, where to go for treatment. We will continue to be your trusted messenger when it comes to that. And in closing, I just want to say, it seems to me, and I don't want to tear up, but I get emotional about thinking about restoring the Voting Rights Act, because John Lewis was so much the face and the voice of that movement. But what I know is that John told us, gave us the roadmap. He told us over and over again, never give up, never give in. If we close our eyes, we can even hear him say, you know, keep your eyes on the prize. Keep the faith.
Well, we certainly appreciate that. And my final words is this here. I'm actually, you see me wearing a shirt that say Alpha's Vote. But here's the deal. I'm going to change this here. This actually is the back of the shirt. And it says right here, no vote, no voice. Simple as that. No vote, no voice. And so if you're out there complaining, if you want to see stuff change, if you want to see all kinds of different things happen out here in our society, it's real simple. All you got to do is vote. And if you don't vote, shut the hell up. Thanks for watching.